most of our comments here were focused on the off-campus sector. Certainly some were on campus. And as the industry develops, what we noticed in the US was once private guys had done all the building they wanted to do, they had built development machines, and then they started going on campus and offering on-campus contractor services and property management services to universities and colleges. But in terms of on the off-campus basis, how do you build an apartment portfolio? Well, you can buy existing student housing, and I'll walk through a number of the transactions that we've done in the last year, and they're in the blue folder that you've got. You could build purpose-built new student housing. Again, that's a tricky thing to do if you haven't been in that business before. Maybe buying a property, as one of the speakers here suggested, would be a good way to start. And then the other one that's maybe less risky is converting another property into student housing. I've been involved in the conversion of an office building to purpose-built student housing, and we're involved in the conversion of a hotel to purpose-built student housing. I mean, the number one criteria that this property has to have is location, right? I mean, that's what this business is all about. This is location sensitive. You get the location right, you're well on your way to winning. You get the location wrong, it's going to be difficult if you just get the location wrong. So I want to cover some transactions that we've done and just talk about them at a fairly high level. Most of the people who've bought them are in this room. This was the office building conversion. That I was quite involved in this from the initial acquisition through to the change in use and then to the construction and the lease up, and really learned a lot about this building. I actually wound up living in the building for 3 weeks during the lease up period, and it was really a great experience. I met 440 parents from all over the world, and I asked them, "What do you want?" Right? This was at McGill, and really, the simple answer was, "Cost is not our issue. Make this easy for us." And that's what I learned in the business. Make this easy for us. And if you want pots and pans, we'll give you that. If you want the fridge stocked, I'm getting carried away here, but you get the idea. I don't know why in our business we say you've got to sign a 12-month lease and this is it. If I go to rent a car, I don't rent it for their period of time, I rent it for my period of time. Now I'm going to pay more. So I think 8-month leases might make sense. 4-month leases might make sense in certain markets if you can get a high enough price. And Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, Quebec City, places like that to have a high tourist trade and a lot of language schools. I think a lot of these people can absorb housing in the summer months that are peak months for hotels, right? So there's more than one way to kind of skin the cat here. This is another building. This is a building in Oshawa. This one actually happened to be LEED certified. And that was interesting because I thought that would help sell it. It was an institutional buyer that bought it. It wasn't. So my conclusion was, right now anyways, LEED certification is not going to get you a premium on your building. While everybody talks about it, they're just looking at the income and the income stream, and that was sort of the lesson learned. Sort of the sister building here in Hamilton. And again, this was LEED certified. They had solar panels on the roof. There's a way to collect the rainwater to flush the toilets. All pretty cool stuff. But at the end of the day, the investor just kind of kept saying, what's the NOI in the building? What's the cap rate on it? And that's how they wound up buying the building. And I've talked to a number of pension funds, and they all say, we'd like something LEEDs, but we're certainly not going to pay for it up front. Maybe at the end we'd stretch for it a little bit. So I think that's a story that's still unfolding. This was the first building that we got involved in, and it was built by the developer, and I sold it now twice in the 8-year period. But this was the one I referred to in London that was fairly far away from the campus. Ironically, when the developer asked me to do the feasibility study, it was the first one we ever did. I recommend he not build the building. And he just sort of said, listen, I'm building this thing, I think I'm right, and it turned out he was. This was fairly far away from the campus, a couple of kilometers, but it was very close to, if you know London at all, Richmond Row. It's very close to that, and a number of students chose to live there. Number one, for the amenities and the quality of the building, and number two, the location was not a deterrent. Sometimes it was an enhancement. This was a townhouse property. I will have to say that townhouses are a little bit tougher to manage. You don't control the front door the way you can with a high-rise, and that's one nice thing about a high-rise. Parents are particularly concerned about security for their children. You can control a front door with a concierge, with a fob, with cameras and things like that. For a mid-rise or a townhouse type community, you can't really have that control structure, coming in. I mean, you can do it with gates for cars, but people walking in you can't control. With one front door, you can absolutely do that. So townhouses do have their challenge, and we really haven't built here a lot of high density frame product, and that's something that Mark mentioned in his seminar that I think we probably could do. This was a large portfolio that was built in Waterloo, and it was actually purchased by the university itself. Sometimes the university is the end buyer for your product. And this was a property that was sold recently in Waterloo, and you can see Greg mentioned, you know, the price per unit. The price per unit can get pretty darn high here, right? At $400,000 per unit. But again, so he said, you know, that's a risky place to be, so I need to be paid for that, you know, for that risk that I'm taking when I buy a unit at that price, which I thought was sort of a clever answer. So in terms of student housing feasibility studies, we do these studies for developers. And really, we have to answer a couple of questions. You know, do the students living in this market need this type of property built? I really learned this, all students are not the same, and all parents are not the same. Kids that go to the better schools where you require higher marks are generally more affluent, and their parents have more money. Schools that have a lot of international students many times have more money because that student is paying $25,000 a year in tuition. So for him to spend $8,000 a month in rent is not a big deal, right? Some students in Quebec pay $2,000 a year for tuition. It's a big deal to pay $8,000 a month for rent. Does that make sense? So no, $8,000 a year, but yeah. So, but you know what I mean, right? Like, so it's oftentimes tied to the school, the caliber of the school, the number of international students and things like that. And the more I know about the student housing business, the more I realize the devil is in the detail. You've really got to understand the particular institution. And you know, does the property have the characteristics that the luxury student renter will pay for? And when you're building student housing, I think you really, if you're going to be building in urban areas, you pretty much have to build luxury student housing. You can't build sort of plain Jane product because you need to get that extra rent that the luxury product's going to get you to make your pro forma pencil out. So typically when we're talking to developers, we're saying to them, look, you're aiming at the top 10 or the top 20% of the residual students that need housing. And I'm going to go through that calculation with you in a moment. So when people typically come to us for a feasibility study, and we've probably done about 20 or 25, I'm going to say 5 of those projects have been built, and a number of the ones that we've done are going to be built. You know, the client is in the conceptual stage, so they're just coming to you saying, look, we've got a piece of dirt, it's close to the school, he's got a little bit of a vision, we just want to bring it into focus with them. And what we typically say to the client is, don't tell us what you're thinking of building, because oftentimes you bias your consultant by saying, I want to build this. Don't tell us what you're thinking. Let us give you our view as to what you should build there, and let's compare that to your vision. Sometimes we have clients come to us in later stages where, you know, they've got an advanced design. We had one client come to us where the building was half built, and then he asked us to do a feasibility study. I said, it's a bit late, but you know, luckily there was a basement where they really hadn't planned on doing anything, and we wound up putting a movie theater down there, a fitness facility, a separate weight room, and so we just got lucky that there was space there. But I think the amenity space here is extremely important. Don't underestimate the value of the amenity space. In a 140,000 square foot building, we'll put 7,000 or 8,000 square feet of amenity space in it, right? And the bigger the building gets, the cheaper the amenity. Make sense? So if I'm going to put in like a world-class gym and I've got 200 students, that might be a little expensive to do. But if I put in a world-class gym and I've got 600, 700, 800 students, then the cost of that gym goes down. Make sense? So you can actually afford to amenitize student housing more than you can a conventional apartment building. So if you're building a conventional apartment building of 140,000 square feet, you're going to have maybe 140 families live there. Fair enough? But if you're building a student housing building, you could have 450 students live there and 450 families paying that rent. So that's how you have to think in student housing. You can amenitize it more, and you can afford to do that. So in terms of our student housing feasibility study, you know, we sort of asked the question first, what's the demand for student housing in the market, right? How many student housing beds can be absorbed? And how fast would those be absorbed? Because if you can't lease it all up in 1 year, that's a problem. If you can't get full by September 1, that's a big problem because there's no plan B in this business. You're waiting till May. If you're building a conventional apartment building and you miss your construction date, instead of September, it's October, it's not the end of the world. You can still keep renting. So this is a very, very time-sensitive business, and lease-up is sort of everything in this business. What unit mix should you be including and what sizes should you be building? Now, if you're building out in the burbs, land is relatively cheap, right? If you're building in downtown Toronto or downtown Ottawa, land is going to be much more expensive. And so you're probably going to wind up building a different unit mix or unit sizes in downtown Toronto than you might build at Brock University in St. Catharines, for example, where land will be a different price. Okay? By the way, I don't know if we mentioned it. We're going to send you guys all the presentations that we've done here in a little email package or in some Dropbox. You'll get a code and you can access it all. Okay? Next, what amenities should be included, and then what rents should be achievable. I would say that by and large, the rents are higher than you think, and that's because parents will spend the money for their children to get, to get the best education possible, and tied to that is their housing. I think our generation of parents maybe didn't all go to university or college. Most of us probably have. We realize the value of this, and we're willing to pay for it, and we're willing to borrow the money to pay for it also if we need to. So here's how the student housing demand works. If you look at this chart, if you assume on the left-hand side, the entire bar graph here are all the students who go to the university. And be careful about universities. They sometimes create numbers, like something called a full-time equivalent student, which is you add up many part-time students and call that a full-time equivalent student, right? So if you have 10 students taking a ceramic course on Wednesday night, that does not equal one student who will rent an apartment. Make sense? Right? So what you do is you take the entire bar there, and from there you subtract off the students that live locally. Now that's interesting because that's not always the case. Oftentimes students who live locally will still come and live in student housing on campus, and they'll come and live in purpose-built off-campus student housing. If you think about it, if you're from Toronto, many of your friends' children may go to U of T and they may live in the 416 or the 905 area code. They could commute, but they choose not to, or their children want to live downtown. So the market is actually bigger than most people think, and you can never ever fully define that market. If you're interested in that concept, I'll give you some examples afterwards. So from there, you take off all the beds that are on campus. You can't compete with the school. So if the school's got 1,000 beds, their 1,000 beds are going to probably fill up first. Right? Parents feel safer putting their children in school, but most schools only accept first-year students. That's their limit. Then from there, you subtract the total beds off campus. So that would be the purpose-built stuff, pictures of the stuff I've shown you, and then the balance would be the residual. Right? So if the residual is 10,000 students, then I would say you should be targeting 1,000 to 2,000 of those students in the luxury purpose-built student housing at the top of the market, rents, right? Now those top of the market rents are going to be different for everybody. How fast will the building be leased up, and how fast will things get absorbed? Well, that's going to depend on the kind of school that you have here and when. So this would just be, we sort of made up these numbers, but they're sort of philosophical in that if you're leasing up for a community college that has primarily 2-year programs and not enough student housing, the students are only finding out in May, June, July that they're getting into school, right? So your busy month will be August, right? Whereas if you're in a university with 4- and 5-year programs and the students are living in first-year housing, they're coming out of the marketplace, right? 2nd and 3rd-year students, you're leasing, you could probably reverse this graph, right? You can be very busy in January, February, March, and by April you should probably be done for the following September. Make sense? So it's a different leasing schedule depending on the type of school you have and things like that. There's a lot of talk here about amenities. I'm really, and I've studied this business throughout the US, I'm really of the opinion that amenities make a lot of sense, and they don't have to be expensive amenities. It's not particularly expensive to put in study rooms. It's not particularly expensive to put in boardrooms, study carrels, and things like that. It's not particularly expensive to even put in a movie theater. Think about using multi-purpose rooms, or you could think about a room like this. They can bring a wall down here and make this into 2 sort of banquet rooms. Right? So you could have 2 rooms together that have different uses, but if you want to do a major event, then that wall just collapses and things like that, right? I would say that as a rough rule of thumb, the closer you are to the school, probably the less amenities you need because you've got the number 1 amenity, which is location. Make sense? Right? The further you are from the school, if it's going to be a competitive marketplace, then you might need more amenities because you're competing on that. Jay, I need my phone. See the time? Yeah, thanks. So let's now talk about probably the most important thing that you've really got to come to grips with, and that is what's the rent? Because that's really going to drive the pro forma. Taxes are what they are. Remember the charger too, right? Taxes are what they are, and expenses are what they are. Heat, hydro, and water aren't going to change a whole lot. So the thing that's going to change your pro forma here dramatically is the rent, right? And if these buildings are selling at 6 cap rates, then $1 of income is, I don't know, $16, $17, $18 worth of value. And oftentimes when developers pencil out these pro formas, they're very good at land costs, that's what they do. They're very good at construction costs, and they just say, oh, well, the students will pay $700 a month. Well, no, it could be much more than that, and that'll make a huge difference to your performance. So you've got to do your homework properly, and this is sort of the way that you do your homework. You have to look at 3 sources of data. Number one, you've got to look at what the university is charging. And the more the university is charging, the better it is for you, because that's setting some expectation of the rent. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean because the university is charging more that their student housing facility is better. It just means they can charge more, maybe because they're a good university. I've heard that Harvard has terrible student housing. If you're going to go to Harvard, this is where you're going to live, right? And so you've got to think about that. What's the university charging? Number 2, you've got to go off campus. And here we're going to look at the off-campus student housing. So the top building is actually a purpose-built building, but the next 2 are condominium quality buildings that are close by, that have a high percentage of students, or the second one is, and the bottom one is a purpose-built rental building that's 60 or 70% students already. So it's a de facto student housing building. If I were the developer of that apartment building, I would have planned the amenities for that many students, because that's actually quite predictable. They didn't want to build student housing, but oftentimes you'll see many people in the student housing building without necessarily knowing it, or not catering to the students. And I think if you cater to the students, you'll make more money. And one of the ways to do that is to charge by the bed. So next is you go to the off-campus condominiums, which are relatively new products, so they're going to look like what you've built. They don't have the amenities you have, but it gives you some sense. And you can see we took the 2-bedroom apartments and we just divided them by 2, because that's what the students are doing anyways. That's going to give you some sense as to the price per bed. So in Canada, we've got about 942,000 students. I'm going to call about 1 million students probably at the end of the day in our 82 largest institutions. 10% of those students come from foreign countries. These are typically unsubsidized, most times affluent, in need of housing. So if you're paying $25,000 per year, then you can afford $8,000 a year in rent. So one of the first things we look at when we look at a university to build student housing is what's the percentage of international students. Universities have a lot of pressure on them today financially, and they're focused on building classrooms, research space, and not necessarily student living space. I would think that if the private sector built student housing, the universities probably wouldn't, and they're building it because they have to. Typically, it takes 4 to 5 years to graduate with an undergraduate degree, but a number of students take more than 4 years to finish degrees. Good news for student housing operators, not necessarily good news for their parents, but that's just the realities of the marketplace. Universities are focused on providing first-year housing, and your mission to think about if you build student housing is to be the first choice for overflow. Does that make sense? You're not going to compete with the school. They get first dibs on the students. Your choice is to be the first choice for overflow and just be a very, very good neighbor. They talked here a little bit about social marketing and word of mouth. Word of mouth works both ways, both good and bad, right? And the stats. People talk about a negative experience much more than a positive experience. Make sure there's lots and lots of positive experiences. In our first year leasing up the building in Montreal, we brought in a band. We had a room that was huge. We brought in an 8-piece band and just invited all the kids and their friends to come to our building, right? We just wanted to create that buzz. The most dangerous part of student housing is the first year. If you get that first year right, your second year is probably going to go right, because it's all word of mouth after that, right? So this is just a lot of data, and we crunch through a lot of data when we do these studies, but the situation really varies by school. So we said that students are different. True, they're not all the same. Well, schools are very different. They're absolutely not all the same. So for example, that statistic there on about the 6th column, the number of students per bed. So you just take the number of students in a university and you divide it by the number of beds. You'll see that, for example, UBC, University of British Columbia, has 1 bed for every 4.6 students. The University of Montreal has 1 bed for every 38 students. That's very different. Now, both may be in equilibrium, right? Maybe Montreal has a lot of local students, right? And things like that. So you have to drill down deeper. As I said, this is a very, very local business. We do a lot of research in student housing. We track every building built. We track the rents and things like that. And one day we just decided to count the number of beds that there were. And I don't know if we've missed a lot, but this was a fascinating study, and this is what sort of made me go to the city of Waterloo and meet with Ryan Mounsey and his people and say, Waterloo's done something really here quite incredible. If you look at the supply in Waterloo, it's probably approaching 8,000 beds, and there's more coming, right? I'm surprised we didn't have much of a discussion on that today. It just didn't turn out, but there are 8,000 beds. Well, remember earlier I said there's about 900, let's just call it 1 million students in Canada, right? About, I'm going to round the numbers, 50,000 are in Waterloo. Those 50,000 students have 8,000 beds off campus. The other 950,000 students have 7,000 or have 9,000 beds off campus. 2,000 in London and 7,000 in the rest of the country. Does that give you some sense as to maybe the opportunity in student housing development? Now, not all cities are like Waterloo. Waterloo attracts, it's a destination university, about 87%, 82%, depending on the school, of the students come from out of town. Other schools, you'll find 10, 20, 30% of the students come from out of town, right? So you've got to really think about the school. So for example, we've got here in Toronto, York University, which is a big school. Then there's Queen's University in Kingston that's much smaller. But I would argue that Kingston would need more beds than York University, because York University is a commuter school, Queen's University is a destination school. And as the subway gets put into York University, which is going to happen any time now, all of a sudden all those students at York have the opportunity to jump on the subway and fan out throughout the city, right? So what you like is a little bit of an isolated school. There's not much rental around, not much competition around, and the depth of market is strong. So you tend to build for that second and third year, and sometimes fourth year student. So, that number, the initial numbers we saw was 1 million people, students by, 2021. I think we're going to be above that. Canada has a very attractive policy for international students to come here and study. They're allowed to work here. They can apply for immigration later on and things like that. So you just keep that in mind. For many students, this is the first time they're away from home, and it's going to require a fair bit of hand-holding, maybe more than you think. And certainly the parents are actively involved with them. So when we get to this feasibility study stage, what we really have to answer is the question, should you build? And oftentimes the answer is no. Guys come to us, drive down to our office, they're all excited, they've got a site. It's just too far away. Don't build it. If you really want to be in student housing, sell that piece of dirt to a regular apartment guy and go buy a piece of dirt closer to the school, right? You just can't change that fact. What should you build? You've heard a bit of discussion about it here today. Again, it's going to depend on the location. If you're further away from the school, you have to really be cognizant of future competition coming. The school's here, you're here, and if someone builds in the middle here and they build the same product, they're going to win. There's not a lot of loyalty from students. There's not a lot of brand loyalty and things like that. How much can you charge? I think that's a critical question for you to answer, and most times we found that it is more than you think, and I don't think we've ever done a lease up where we didn't hit the rent and we didn't go faster. Okay, you can do dynamic leasing also. So for example, as you start at $500 in January, if you've got only a couple of beds left in May, I'd suggest you raise your rents, because you're going to get some people coming, later on in the year and things like that. We should be thinking about pricing our student housing a little bit of the way that airplane seats are priced, right? Especially once you go through your first year lease up, you'll have a sense as to what the lease up schedule was. If you're ahead of last year's lease up schedule, you should be raising your rents. If you're behind last year's lease up schedule, you should be reducing your rents. So how much can you charge is a dynamic question, but we'll give you the answers to the number you start with, but you've constantly got to be adjusting that during the lease up period. And then how much money will you make if you build and sell it? So far, we haven't been able to do a forward sale just because the industry probably isn't ready for it yet. We've certainly been able to sell apartment buildings on a forward sale basis. So a developer comes to us and says, I've got a piece of dirt, I've got this plan to build a building, can you find us the buyer? It's a tricky negotiation, but you can get that deal done. That's more difficult to do with student housing because nobody can really get a handle on the rent yet, right? And if the developer's going to lease up, then you might as well hold on to it and sell it once it's stabilized. And then who will buy it? When we first took our building out to the marketplace in 2010, we didn't have a lot of takers for the building. But every year that's passed by now, we're having more and more takers. So now we're selling a student housing building. We've seen, 5, 6, 7 offers from credible buyers. When we first started out, we had to pretty much meet the buyer and educate the buyer. The first student housing deal I did was about 96. It took a year and a half to get done, and that whole time was educating the pension fund on the merits of student housing, right? But now that as we talk about this and it's in the discussion, I think the deal flow will be faster, and we need more people to build this. You've got to ask yourself a bunch of questions when you're building student housing in terms of the institution, large versus small, right? So University of Toronto versus Lakehead, very, very different scenarios. Host city, is it large versus small? In a larger city, there's a lot more choice for people there. What's the residual demand, right? And we went through that calculation earlier to understand that. And then you have to figure out what percent of that demand is potentially available for you, right? So just to kind of show it again, if that entire box is the student universe, is the number of students going to school, you take off that left-hand bar, the kids who live close by, then the light orange, you take off the students who live on campus, then the lightest orange color there are the ones who live in other purpose-built student housing. You could take off one more thing there, the vacancy rate in the area. So it's 2%, take 2% of all the apartments out there because they're also out in the marketplace. And then that's going to leave you with this gray area, and that gray area is the total demand. So let's go through and just look at a school here for McMaster University. You have 24,000 students there. You have 6,000 coming from the host city. So that host city would be the Hamilton region. Well, I happen to live in Burlington, Ontario, just outside of Hamilton, and lots of our friends have their kids go to McMaster University, and they live on campus, which shocks the heck out of me. You're 15 minutes away. Why would you go there? Well, they wanted them to have that student experience. They wanted them to grow up. They wanted them to get out of the house, whatever it was. But so that's why I'm saying it's tricky to pin down what the depth of the market is, because the local kids are living in student housing, right? They go evening for dinner and come home again. But the parents want to be off camp, want them out of the house, or the kids want to get out of the house, and that'll happen. So, but because you don't know that number, let's take the most conservative scenario: 6,000 students there. So the total demand is about 18,000. From that, you take away the beds on campus. There's only one purpose-built student housing building in Hamilton right now. I showed you the picture of it earlier. You take that off, and that leaves you with 4,200 beds of supply, and that leaves you about 13,000 students. If you want to be fairly conservative, take 10% of that number, and I would argue that if you had a good piece of dirt around Hamilton, you could build 1,300 beds. So just to kind of look at the factors that affect student housing, and I'll sort of start at 12 o'clock and work my way around the clock, is the on-campus rental market situation. So if the university is going to build, you can't compete against them. You can only be building for demand excess of what the school is going to do. So if the school is going to go on a massive student housing building program, you probably need to know that and sort of check yourself. You've got to understand what the off-campus housing market is. In a lot of cities, it's non-existent. So if you go to Edmonton and Calgary, or I would say almost west of Ontario, you're not going to find maybe any purpose-built student housing that's of any significance out there. The University of Alberta in Edmonton is a huge university with lots of money. It's got an ambitious plan to grow, and that, for example, would be a great place to build if you can find some land close by. You have to look at the local conventional rental marketplace, and that's where the majority of students live today. They're living either in houses or they're living in apartment buildings that are close by. So you've got to study the local market. CMHC puts out a ton of data which you can study that you can't necessarily make perfect conclusions from, because it's 30 and 40-year-old buildings and you're building something new. But if the average rent in Windsor is $600 and the average rent in Ottawa is $1,100, you know you're going to get more rent in Ottawa, right? So it's just going to kind of go like this proportionally. The condominium rental market, Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, Montreal to some extent, there are lots of condos for rent, and that represents newer product, albeit not in the form that you would build it, because you wouldn't build 2-bedroom apartments. But sometimes you'll find some 2 bedrooms and dens that 3 students will rent, and you'll get a sense as to what the price per bed is. Not the perfect comparison to make, but it is something to look at. Certainly you have to look at converted single-family homes, the ghetto. Most cities have them, and you can tell where the students live. Barbecues on the front porch, there's a sofa on the front porch, the blue boxes out, all the stuff you wouldn't do or your mom wouldn't let you do, you know, that kind of thing. The ability of the students to pay. And parents' incomes are different for, you know, for different universities. So you've got to consider all those factors. You know, you've also got to look at, you know, student default rates to get some sense as to the health of the, you know, of the financial health of the people going to school. Interestingly enough, default rates are published, and so that would give me a pretty good indication as to the roughly, it's not a perfect correlation, but I would think that if there's a high default rate of student loans, then there might be a diminished capacity to pay. Does that make sense? So you might want to look at the schools that have very, very high ratios of paying back the loan. So a couple of other factors affecting student housing. We talked about it today. Seasonality. There is only one September 1. You got to make that target. Sharing housing. Glenn made a really good salient point. I wish there was more time to flush it out. What he said is that students who are living a little more communally have a better university experience versus kids that get their own door, lock the door, don't talk to anyone, and sit on the internet all night, right? So the music's loud next door, he emails the guy next door instead of talking to him, right? Because they both got their doors locked and things like that. I saw a study in the US that talked about how students in a shared room, not exactly what we're saying here to build today, actually had a better experience because they couldn't sit there in their room and look at each other all day. They actually got out and they joined clubs, they went to the gym and things like that. So I think I'm recommending you build, you know, 1 bedroom, 1 bath, but you might want to put your children in a double room, okay? Upper year versus first year students, you know, there is a difference. First years generally go to the university. Second, third, and we found fourth year, by the way, are the ones that stay in the 4-bedroom apartments. International students are important, and the decision-making process is between the parent and the student, and they've got very, very different requirements. So there's a couple more slides to go. Location is the critical factor. Amenities need to be student-specific, and I think school-specific, one size doesn't fit all. The students are looking for a balance of private space and community space. I'll give you an example that really just brought this home to me. I was living in this building in Montreal. I was on my 3rd week there. I'd met hundreds of parents, and this lady came in, and she was from Lebanon, and she was obviously just quite wealthy by the way she talked and things like that. And the building had 3, 4, and 5-bedroom units in it, and that's all we had. And she came there and said, I want my son to live in a 1-bedroom unit, and if not, I'll go somewhere else and rent it. And I said, you know, one of the reasons your son is coming to Canada to study is to get a great education here, but also to make friends from all over the world. And if he lives in a 1-bedroom apartment by himself, he may leave with 5 friends. If he lives in a 3-bedroom apartment, his 2 other roommates will have 5 friends, and he might know 15 people. And she wound up putting him in the 5-bedroom. Right? You sort of get the idea that it's about relationships. In life, it's about relationships. The more people you know, the better off your life is going to be. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity here to build student housing in most of the markets in Canada. In terms of the, and again, we're going to send these to you, the student housing hierarchy, generally on campus gets the highest price per square foot. Now they do have the advantage of doing 8-month leases, which typically aren't going to make any sense for you, right? Then the off-campus student housing gets the highest price, then the conventional apartments, you know, then the single-family home, then the condominium is a bit of a wild card depending on the age, right? You know, I thought this was interesting. Of the students, you know, in the year 2012, 96,000, a good 10% of them were international students. I thought this was an interesting stat. There are more international students in Canada than there are Canadian students who leave their province. It was interesting, isn't it? So there are more international students coming here than there are Ontarians going to Quebec or to Manitoba or wherever it is. So, you know, to develop an action plan to build student housing, you need to know the current demand. You need to look at that residual demand. Sort of the good news there is universities publish a lot of data. If you were going to go do a rental study, you don't know exactly who's in this area, where they come from, what they're studying, what their age is, you know, the ratio of male to female and things like that. Most universities publish that data, so it helps you understand the student demographics and understanding the university. So know the market, know what's coming, because this is a finite business. If you overbuild student housing, there's no plan B. So if 10 guys are planning to build around University A and they don't know about it, it could be a problem, right? And if it becomes a problem, it's going to be the guy that's closest that's going to win if the marketplace gets overbuilt. I think we're really a long, long way from that in Canadian cities, but it's something you have to think about as you're planning. Finding good locations. Toronto's particularly hard to build student housing in because the condo market was so strong, and U of T is in such a fabulous area of Toronto, right? But as the condo market comes off, I suspect that maybe there are some condos that are going to fail, and they may be great for student housing. So if you've got a good residual demand, it doesn't matter if you're 5 kilometers away. It's probably not going to work. You know, despite the bus and all that, I think that's the exception. And you got to tailor the amenities to your students. I mentioned earlier at McGill, we put in it was an office building, and there were 2 big safes in it. And it was going to cost $30,000 to remove the safe, so we just made it into soundproof music studios. It already had thick walls, right? And doing things like that to customize it to the school a little bit, I think would just be probably well appreciated by the school and would tie you to the school to some extent. Never name your building after the university. Don't call it McGill Apartments or something like that. The school's not going to be happy. University View is a good name if you're facing the school, but I don't think I'd put the name of the university right into the name of it. Okay? So here's the gap in the marketplace, and then when we recognize this gap, this is what our company set out to fill, and really the purpose of our meeting today with you is, number one, there's an opportunity to build student housing. It's still relatively early days. It is a finite market, but it is nowhere near being full. So there is I wouldn't say first move advantage, but pretty close to first move advantage for someone or a group of people who have a pan-Canadian vision here to build student housing. So what we help developers do is to first find the land, which is the most important part. You can't do anything without a site. Find the equity money, and then it's train the developer. And it does take some time to take off your condo hat, take off your landlord hat, and rethink this business. Complete the feasibility study, help with the financing, and then help with the lease up, and that really is the key. Oftentimes I've seen good projects, very viable projects, not lease up well because they just didn't market it properly, right? And then they wound up charging a lower rent to offset their poor marketing, and then that sets the base. So in the second year, you're kind of working off that base. So what you really need to get off to is a great first 50 beds, right? Where you've worked really hard, you've marketed hard, you're under construction, you've built a model, you're doing hard hat tours, whatever the case is, but get that strike price high because you need that, you know, to make this successful. And then the managing of the property, again, I've been on the dark side of some of these deals. We've been called into the lease up where the lease up's gone wrong, and that takes a while to fix up. You know, in a regular apartment building, you don't have that massive communication using social marketing. So, you know, you can come and say under new management and you can actually, you know, get away with it for a while. In the student housing business, that's spread very, very quickly, and it's going to take a few years to get over a problem that you had, and everyone's going to know it. And I wouldn't have believed it up until I actually saw it. And then the final thing for the developers, you know, what's your exit strategy? Are you a build and hold, build and sell, or are you sort of something in between with a joint venture partner? So certainly, if you want to see a feasibility study, we've got some guys out there, we can share one with you. But there is a terrific opportunity here to build student housing, and that's the reason we put on this presentation today. So thank you very much for coming. God bless you, and we'll see most of you tomorrow then for new apartment construction. Thank you.